Oh no. Wait, it's starting? Okay. So it's recording. Very good. All right. Welcome back, fifth grade, to chapter 5. At the end of chapter 4, Seth, it was like Christmas Eve for him. He couldn't sleep. His brain was busy with work coming up and the celebration of Labor Day. Labor Day is a holiday that comes at the end of summer, and that's also a time when the oceans are very warm because summer sun has been beaming down on them and heating them up and making them ripe for hurricanes. Let's start chapter 5. A loud clap of thunder woke me before daylight Tuesday morning. Bed spring squeaked as Matt and Lucas rolled over and settled into sleep again. I lay there, waiting, and then lightning lit the room. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 5. Thunder rolled again, already sounding farther away. I turned out the alarm and went to the windows. The storm had swept in from the southeast, and as I watched, another blue-white lightning strike turned rooftops and trees into a landscape of winter white and shadow. I groaned. I groaned. Rain would ruin everything. But apparently, I'd slept through the worst of it. By 5:30, the storm had blown over, and my first day of work lay ahead of me. Damp, but promising. I slipped downstairs, ate a cold breakfast of bread and leftover ham, and packed more of the same for later. Careful not to wake anyone, I carried my hat and shoes to the front steps and was down the street before the sun had peaked above the horizon. The thunderstorm had lowered the temperature slightly, making my walk the most pleasant since I'd arrived. The birds must have felt it too. Doves cooed and roosters crowed, seagulls glided overhead till their beady eyes spotted some discarded scrap. Then dozens would appear from nowhere, thieving from one another and starting a fracas of calls. Block after block, I heard babies wake and cry for their mothers. Doors squeaked open, pans rattled on stoves, and streams of milk from full cows hit empty buckets. What a lovely image you can get there of Galveston waking up. I smelled horses and hay, bacon and biscuits, and before long, a salty breeze. What a lovely walk he has here. Hay, bacon, biscuits, and the ocean. The salty breeze lifted the scent of fresh lumber and carried it right to me. Just ahead, only 2 blocks from the beach, lay the houses where I'd be working. I was the first to arrive, and in the long shadows of early morning, I walked through the unfinished houses, each one at a different stage of completion. They'd all been built from one plan, but cleverly changed in some way. A side gable here, or a front gable there, a different window or door, arched porch lintels and cut-out railings on one, turn post with Victorian balustrades on another. So this is Seth getting all geeky with architecture and building here. I climbed a ladder, left leaning against the third house, stood on the unfinished gallery, and looked out over the gulf. The sun, still low, shimmered across the waves, a reminder of the heat yet to come. Even with the slightly cooler breeze, I felt sweat beading under my shirt and trickling down my back. My first day at work would be a hot one. He hasn't even started working yet. He just showed up and he's already sweating. Hey, a voice called from below. I stepped closer to the unprotected edge of the gallery, which is a porch, down there, and glanced below at a young man who looked to be a few years older than me. You shouldn't be up there, he said. Sorry, I yelled down, wishing I'd waited on the ground instead of prowling around. It's my first day, and I guess I'm a bit curious. I climbed down while he watched, his blonde hair and blue eyes vivid against a sun-browned face. You're the new helper? I nodded and held out my hand. I'm Seth Braden. He peered at me, and under the brim of his straw hat. Henry Covington, he said, ignoring my hand. Rude. You look young. I let my hand fall to my side. I'm almost 17. Yeah, like I said, young. Got any experience? Some. He gave me a skeptical look, which, along with the ignored handshake, I took as bad signs. I hadn't been here 5 minutes, and already someone didn't like me. While I stared at him, trying to remember where I'd heard his name, another man arrived. You two meet? Henry turned, and to my surprise, his attitude toward me seemed to turn just as quickly. Yes, sir, Mr. Farrell, we have. This is Seth Braden, your new man, and he looks pretty able, if you ask me. Mr. Farrell's grin crinkled the corners of his eyes and showed a gap between his front teeth. Glad to meet you, Seth. Your uncle tells me you're a fine carpenter, almost as good as your father. Thank you, Mr. Farrell. I appreciate this opportunity, and I'll sure do my best for you. He nodded. Fair enough. He looked past Henry and called out to a young colored man standing barefoot by the raised basement. Come on over here, boy. The man trudged through the sand, his dark limbs willow limber and just as graceful. That's Josiah, Mr. Farrell told me. Now, I allow I wasn't too excited about working a colored boy, but he appears to be a dang good carpenter and minds what he's told. If he gives you trouble, Seth, you let me know. So, what can we infer about Mr. Farrell and the way he treats Josiah? What can we infer here? Does he like the fact that he has a colored boy or African American working for him? Why does he seem so surprised that he actually can build houses? What's up with this Mr. Farrell? Yes, sir, I said, though I couldn't imagine what kind of trouble Mr. Farrell might expect. A closer look at Josiah told me he was younger than I first thought, nearer to my age than Henry's. It was his height that fooled me. He looked to be at least 6 foot. I nodded my greeting, and he nodded back, barely meeting my eyes before he dropped his gaze to the ground. What can we infer about this? If you're afraid to look someone in the eye and you're staring at the ground, what does that tell us about how you feel when you're in this place? Let's go to work, boys, Mr. Farrell said. But where's Zach and Frank and Charlie? Henry asked. Are we going to have to work double time to make up for the 3 musketeers today? I saw Mr. Farrell's jaw tighten. I gave the Judson boys time off for the funeral, remember? No, sir. I mean, yes, sir. Henry's face flushed red. I guess I did forget about their daddy dying and all. Mr. Farrell shook his head and turned his back on Henry. We're working 3 men short today, he said to me and pointed to the 3rd house. Think you can build a staircase? Yes, sir. Good. Then you and Henry start on that while me and Josiah finish framing up the top floor. If there's something you're not sure about, ask before you cut lumber, not after. Yes, sir, I said again and followed Henry to the 3rd house. You weren't trying to hornswoggle the boss, were you? He asked over his shoulder. Hornswoggle? Anybody here infer what hornswoggle means? Like trying to dupe him or trick him? Yeah, about knowing how to build a staircase. I shook my head. It's a bit foolish to say you can do something when you can't. So, how many you built before this one? I've helped my father with a dozen or so, and I built one myself. 1, he laughed. Well, I guess that makes you the helper, doesn't it? He pointed to the lumber in the basement. You bring out the sawhorses and 2x12s, and I'll get the tools. I ducked my head and trudged off to the basement, wondering how I could prove anything at all to Papa if I had to work with someone like Henry. Henry doesn't seem to like Seth a whole lot, and Mr. Farrell seems to be a bit of a racist towards Josiah. So, Chapter 6, we'll find out more about who these characters really are. Thanks for joining me.